The emergency room of Metropolitan General was a toxic soup, a suffocating miasma of human suffering, steeped in the aggressively sterile scent of antiseptic. Polished linoleum floors, perpetually slick with something unseen, reflected the relentless, strobing dance of overhead fluorescent lights, casting everyone in a pale, sickly glow that made the living look half dead and the dying seem already gone. The air itself was a physical weight, thick with the metallic tang of fear, the cloying sweetness of blood, the bitter aroma of burnt coffee, and the ever-present, bleach-sharp smell of a battle against chaos that was always, inevitably, being lost. It was a place of profound, controlled pandemonium, a kingdom of beeping monitors that sang a constant, chaotic symphony of life's fragility, punctuated by the rhythmic squeak of gurney wheels and the muffled, desperate sobs that leaked from behind thin privacy curtains. Into this relentless pressure cooker, Nurse Alara Vance moved like a ghost. But not the kind that inspires fear or awe. She was the sort of ghost that one bumps into without noticing, a creature of quiet apologies and downcast eyes, a study in deliberate self-effacement. Her public persona, carefully cultivated over 6 agonizingly long months, was one of profound, almost catastrophic incompetence. They called her Butterfingers Vance, a nickname earned on her first day when a full tray of sterile instruments had met the floor with a clatter that seemed to stop every heart in the ER for a full second. Since then, her reputation had only solidified. 4 bags would inexplicably slip from her grasp, charts would be fumbled, and her steps, once so measured and silent on the fractured earth of forgotten war zones, were now a clumsy, shuffling gait that seemed to apologize for taking up space. She was the bottom of the food chain, a meek, silent figure who spent most of her shifts restocking supply closets, mopping up spills, often her own, and absorbing the casual, venomous cruelty of her superiors with a quiet, mumbled, "Sorry, ma'am." This was her penance, her sanctuary. Every dropped tray was a prayer for anonymity. Every fumbled vial a shield against a past that screamed in the silence of her tiny apartment. The muscle memory of 1,000 life-or-death procedures was buried deep beneath a mountain of feigned ineptitude, a dormant volcano of competence held in check by the sheer force of her will. She was hiding in plain sight, a predator masquerading as the weakest of prey. The apex predator of this particular jungle, however, was head nurse Brenda Ratchet. She was a woman whose entire identity was constructed from the brittle framework of hospital bureaucracy and her own perceived authority. Her posture was aggressively rigid, her scrubs starched to the point of being a weapon, and her face was a permanent mask of condescending disapproval. She moved through the ER not as a healer, but as a warden, her eyes constantly scanning for the slightest infraction of her sacred protocols. Her voice was her primary instrument of power, a sharp, nasal weapon she wielded with surgical cruelty, slicing away at the confidence of younger nurses and terrifying orderlies into submission. Her primary motivation, a pathological insecurity that festered just beneath her sterile exterior, manifested as an unyielding obsession with the hierarchy. Competence in her subordinates was not a resource to be nurtured, but a threat to be aggressively extinguished, and in Alara Vance, she had found the perfect target, a bottomless well into which she could pour all her venomous disdain. The morning's ritual of humiliation began, as it often did, near the nurse's station. Alara was carefully, painstakingly attempting to replace a sharps container, her movements deliberately slow and uncertain. Ratchet swept in behind her, her presence a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. "Vance!" she snapped, the single word cracking like a whip. Alara flinched, a practiced Pavlovian response. The sharps container slipped, not falling, but tilting precariously. Ratchet's lip curled into a sneer. "Can you not perform even the simplest task without turning it into a potential catastrophe? I've seen sloths with more coordination. Look at me when I'm speaking to you." Alara's gaze lifted from the floor to meet Ratchet's cold, merciless eyes for a fraction of a second before dropping again. "Sorry, head nurse," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "It was slippery." Ratchet let out a short, barking laugh. "Everything is slippery for you, isn't it, dear? Perhaps we should issue you a helmet and pads. Now fix it, and try not to contaminate the entire ward while you're at it." She spun on her heel and stalked away, leaving a wake of chilled silence. A young, kind-eyed orderly named Leo quietly moved to Alara's side, steadying the container with a gentle hand. "Don't listen to her," he whispered, offering a small, worried smile. "She runs on coffee and cruelty." Alara just nodded, her face an unreadable mask, her internal world a raging, silent storm. The first sign of the day's tectonic shift was a distant percussive roar, a sound so profoundly out of place in the urban drone that it momentarily silenced the ER's internal chaos. Heads lifted. A few seconds later, the wail of sirens began, not the familiar lone cry of a single ambulance, but a chorus, a wave of screaming, approaching dread that grew exponentially louder, closer, more desperate. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. Dr. Ben Carter, a former Army Ranger, whose cynicism was as sharp as his diagnostic skills, moved to the ambulance bay doors, his face a mask of grim anticipation. He'd seen enough in his time to know that sound. It was the sound of mass casualties. It was the sound of a very, very bad day. Then the doors burst open, and the outside world violently invaded their sterile sanctuary. It wasn't a multi-vehicle pileup or a bus crash. It was a scene of targeted, military-grade destruction. The first gurneys carried men in dark, expensive suits, their bodies shredded by shrapnel, their white shirts stained a catastrophic, blossoming red. They were followed by paramedics shouting acronyms and vitals, their faces pale with shock. The ER, already operating at capacity, was instantly overwhelmed. The organized chaos devolved into pure, unadulterated pandemonium. Head nurse Ratchet, seeing the influx of high-profile patients, immediately shifted into her element. Not medical intervention, but bureaucratic control. "Trauma 1 and 2 for the principals," she shrieked, her voice somehow rising above the din. "I want a full security lockdown. Someone get me the hospital administrator on the phone, now. Carter, you're on the primary." Her orders were a performance of authority, a desperate attempt to impose the comforting fiction of protocol onto a situation that had already gone catastrophically off script. She was managing the crisis, not treating the patients. The primary patient, the one Ratchet had designated for Dr. Carter, was a man of immense importance. His face, ashen and beaded with sweat, was vaguely familiar from news broadcasts. A foreign diplomat, a key figure in fragile peace negotiations. He was surrounded by a phalanx of frantic, well-armed security personnel who were adding to the chaos, their weapons drawn, their eyes wild. The diplomat had a ghastly, visible wound, a deep laceration across his shoulder and chest, bleeding profusely. Ratchet immediately pointed at it. "Massive bleeder. Get 4 units of ONEG in him and prep for immediate surgical intervention. He's losing pressure from that thoracic wound." It was a classic, textbook response. A diagnosis based on the most obvious, most dramatic injury. It was also completely, utterly, and fatally wrong. The crisis escalated with terrifying speed. The diplomat, now on the bed in Trauma 1, began to seize. The rhythmic beeping of his heart monitor accelerated into a frantic, high-pitched scream before flatlining into a single, deafening tone. "He's in V-fib! Paddles!" Carter yelled, his voice strained. He pressed the charged paddles to the man's chest. The body arched violently. The monitor blipped, showed a weak, thready rhythm, and then flatlined again. "No response!" someone shouted. Ratchet, standing at the foot of the bed, her face a mask of rising panic, began shouting useless, contradictory orders. "More epinephrine! Check the leads! Is the blood flowing? Why isn't the blood working?" She was focused on her initial, flawed diagnosis, unable to pivot, unable to see what was truly happening. Her carefully constructed world of checklists and procedures had crumbled, leaving her exposed as a hollow shell of authority, a bureaucrat drowning in a reality she could not manage. She was frozen, a deer in the headlights of her own catastrophic incompetence. Alara had been in the background, a silent wraith tasked with fetching more gauze. The deafening tone of the flatlining monitor cut through the fog of her self-imposed meekness. It was a sound she knew intimately, the soundtrack to her deepest nightmares. Her eyes, so often downcast, lifted. They swept over the scene, not with panic, but with a cold, analytical fury. Her gaze bypassed the chaos, the shouting, the blood. She saw what they all missed. She saw the subtle, cyanotic blue tint to the diplomat's lips and nail beds, a sign of profound oxygen deprivation. She saw the tiny, almost invisible flecks of metallic dust around the edges of the chest wound, something that wasn't from the vehicle's chassis. She smelled it too, a faint, bitter almond scent, almost completely masked by the smells of blood and antiseptic. It was a smell that instantly transported her back to a dusty, sun-baked village in a forgotten corner of the world, to a bomb maker's workshop and the catastrophic aftermath of a mission gone wrong. Her mind didn't just process the information. It slammed into a conclusion with the force of a battering ram. It wasn't the bleeding. It was never the bleeding. The shrapnel was coded. A fast-acting organophosphate, a nerve agent designed for assassination, delivered via fragmentation. He wasn't bleeding out. He was suffocating on a cellular level. His diaphragm paralyzed. His lungs useless. Every second they wasted on the wrong problem was a second he slipped further away. In that instant, something inside Alara Vance shattered. The carefully constructed cage of Butterfingers Vance, the meek, clumsy nurse, cracked and fell away into dust. The 6 months of practiced subservience, the mumbled apologies, the shuffling gait, it all evaporated. Her posture, once a defeated slump, straightened with the rigidity of a steel rod. Her shoulders squared. The apologetic softness in her face hardened into something ancient and unyielding, a mask of absolute, predatory focus. Her movements, once so fumbling, became a blur of seamless, lethal efficiency. It was a transformation so sudden, so profound, that it was almost violent. The statue had cracked, and the warrior within had emerged, forged in the crucible of unimaginable violence and honed by years of relentless, high-stakes medical intervention. The ghost was back. Her voice, when she spoke, was unrecognizable. It was not the meek whisper of Alara Vance. It was a low, calm, resonant command that cut through the hysterical noise of the trauma bay like a surgeon's scalpel. It was the voice of Staff Sergeant Ghost Vance, a voice that had guided Green Berets through kill zones and talked dying soldiers through their last moments. "Stop," she said. The single word carried such absolute, unquestionable authority that for a moment, everyone, including Dr. Carter with the defibrillator paddle still in his hands, froze and turned to look at her. She moved from the periphery to the center of the room, her steps silent and deliberate, a predator entering a kill zone. She didn't ask for permission. She took command. "He's not in cardiac arrest. It's respiratory paralysis from a chemical agent. The paddles are useless." She locked eyes with a terrified-looking junior nurse. "Get me the entire atropine supply from the crash cart, and 2 grams of pralidoxime. Now! Move!" The nurse, mesmerized by her sheer force of will, simply nodded and ran. She turned to Dr. Carter, her eyes boring into his. "We need to secure his airway. A standard intubation will be too slow, and his jaw is seizing." Her hands were already moving, snatching a scalpel and a length of IV tubing from a nearby tray. "I need to open his throat." The words, so brutal, so direct, hung in the air. Carter, whose own extensive field experience as a ranger gave him a flicker of recognition for the kind of competence he was witnessing, hesitated for only a second. He saw the cold certainty in her eyes, the flawless economy of her movements, and made a split-second decision. He nodded. "Do it." Alara didn't need to be told twice. With a speed that was terrifying to behold, she located the cricothyroid membrane with 2 fingers, her touch precise and unerring. The scalpel flashed, a single, perfect vertical incision. She inserted the handle of the scalpel, twisted it 90 degrees to open the airway, and then slid the IV tubing into the trachea. It was a brutal, improvised, field-expedient cricothyrotomy, a procedure of last resort, performed with the chilling, flawless grace of someone who had done it a dozen times before under gunfire. The moment the tube was in, she took the ambu bag and began manually forcing air into the diplomat's lungs. A few seconds later, the flat line on the monitor broke. A weak, struggling rhythm appeared. It wasn't stable, but it was a heartbeat. She had pulled him back from the absolute brink of death. The spell of Alara's authority was shattered by a shriek of pure, incandescent rage. Head Nurse Ratchet, her face a mottled mask of crimson fury, finally snapped out of her stupor. Her panic had been replaced by a territorial, bureaucratic fury that was far more dangerous. The source of her humiliation was not her own incompetence, but this rookie. This clumsy, insignificant nobody who had dared to usurp her command. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" she screeched, her voice vibrating with venom. "That is an unsanctioned procedure. You just assaulted a patient. You are so far beyond fired. Security! Get security in here now. Get this thing away from him." She lunged forward, her hands clawing, trying to physically rip Alara away from the diplomat. Alara didn't even turn her head. As Ratchet's hands reached for her, she shifted her weight almost imperceptibly. Her left arm came up in a smooth, fluid arc, not a strike, but a block, intercepting Ratchet's wrist. She used the head nurse's own momentum to guide her past, spinning her off balance. It was a simple, non-violent redirection, executed with the profound, effortless skill of a martial artist. And it sent the much larger woman stumbling into a supply cart with a loud crash. Alara never took her eyes off the patient's vitals, never missed a single beat in her rhythmic squeezing of the ambu bag. "Doctor," she said, her voice still unnervingly calm. "The atropine." Dr. Carter, his face a mixture of shock and dawning, profound respect, broke from his trance and moved to administer the antidote Alara had demanded. He looked at Ratchet, now sputtering on the floor amidst a pile of scattered bandages, and then back at the quiet, terrifyingly competent nurse who had just saved a man's life with a pocket knife and a piece of plastic. A new, absolute authority had been established in Trauma 1, and it had nothing to do with titles or name badges. It was the authority of pure, unyielding competence. But the crisis was far from over. It was about to escalate from a medical emergency into a combat situation. Alara had seen the subtle cues the moment the gurneys had burst through the doors, but her focus had been on the primary patient. Now, with the diplomat's airway secured, her senses expanded, her situational awareness reaching out like an invisible net. She registered two men, both dressed in orderly scrubs that were too new, too clean. They hadn't been helping. They had been observing, positioning themselves, waiting for an opportunity. Their lack of panic in the surrounding chaos was a deafening alarm bell in her mind. While all eyes were on the diplomat's dramatic revival, they began to move, their paths converging on Trauma 1. One of them reached under his scrubs, his hand moving towards the small of his back. Alara saw the subtle bulge of a suppressed pistol. Assassins. The crash hadn't been an accident. It was a failed first attempt. This was the second. There was no time to shout a warning, no time for anything but action. Her mind, a tactical computer honed by years of surviving in environments where the wrong decision was your last, processed the geometry of the room, the threats, the available assets. She released the ambu bag into the hands of the now attentive Leo. "Keep this rhythm. Do not stop," she commanded. In the same fluid motion, she spun, her hand grabbing the heavy, stainless steel instrument tray beside her. With a flick of her wrist, she sent it spinning through the air like a discus. It crashed violently into the head of the first assassin, just as he was drawing his weapon. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious, the silenced pistol clattering across the linoleum. The second assassin, startled by the sudden, unexpected assault on his partner, reacted. He drew his own weapon, bringing it up to fire at Alara, but she was already moving. She didn't charge him, she flowed, using the gurneys and the panicked, scattering staff as both cover and concealment. He fired. Crack! The suppressed pop was barely audible over the din. The bullet zipped through the space she had occupied a microsecond before, shattering a computer monitor on the wall behind her. She exploded from behind a gurney, not with a weapon, but with the cricothyrotomy kit's metal handle still clutched in her fist. She moved inside his firing arc, too close for him to effectively target her. A brutal, precise strike to his wrist shattered the bones, sending his gun flying. A second, lightning-fast blow to the side of his neck at the carotid sinus. It wasn't a killing blow. It was a physiological shutdown switch. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed, his nervous system overwhelmed by the sudden, catastrophic drop in blood pressure. She had neutralized two armed, professional assassins in less than 5 seconds, without a firearm, using a medical tray and a surgical tool. The ER fell into a sudden, stunned, absolute silence, broken only by the steady beep of the diplomat's now stable heart monitor and Leo's rhythmic, trembling squeezing of the ambu bag. Alara Vance stood in the center of the carnage, a still, quiet point in a world she had just violently rearranged, her chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. The ghost was well and truly out. The stunned silence was shattered by a new sound, the thunder of heavy boots on linoleum and a series of sharp, barked commands from the ambulance bay. The ER was suddenly flooded again, but this time not by the wounded. Black-clad men, armed with short-barreled rifles and adorned with military insignia, poured into the room, moving with a disciplined, aggressive precision that made the hospital security guards look like frightened children. They formed a perimeter, their weapons sweeping the room, their eyes cold and professional. They were not police. They were Tier 1 operators. At their center walked a man who seemed to be carved from granite. He was tall, ramrod straight, in his late 50s, wearing a decorated military uniform that commanded instant, unquestionable authority. His face was a roadmap of hard-won battles, and his eyes, a piercing, pale blue, scanned the scene of chaos. The stabilized diplomat, the downed assassins, the terrified hospital staff. And finally, they locked onto the still figure of Alara Vance. A flicker of something unreadable, relief, recognition, profound respect, crossed the man's stern features. He ignored the babbling hospital administrator who was rushing towards him, brushed past Dr. Carter, and walked directly to Alara, his boots echoing in the now silent room. He stopped a foot in front of her, his gaze taking in the blood on her scrubs, the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. His voice, when he spoke, boomed with a resonant authority that filled every corner of the vast room, a voice accustomed to commanding armies. "Ghost," he said, the single word imbued with a weight of shared history and immense affection. "I should have known, if there was a 1 in a million chance of survival, you'd be the one making it happen." He turned, his gaze sweeping over the assembled, awe-struck staff, the bewildered security guards, and the now cowering figure of head nurse Ratchet, who was trying to make herself small against a far wall. "For those of you who are confused," General Marcus Thorne began, his voice like an artillery strike, leaving no room for argument. "Allow me to introduce you. This is not Nurse Vance. This is Staff Sergeant Alara Vance, United States Army Special Operations Command. Call sign, Ghost." He took a step closer to Alara, his voice softening with pride, but losing none of its carrying power. "This woman is a decorated combat medic. She holds the Distinguished Service Cross for pulling 5 wounded men out of a kill zone under direct enemy fire. She holds 2 silver stars for valor. She has performed surgical procedures in the dark, on the floors of crashing helicopters, with nothing but a flashlight and a prayer. She has saved more lives in forgotten, sand-blasted corners of the world than this entire hospital will see in a year." Thorne's piercing gaze found Dr. Carter. "Doctor, your patient is alive because she recognized an assassination attempt that your entire team missed." His eyes then moved to the hospital administrator. "And your hospital is secure because she neutralized 2 professional assassins with her bare hands, while your security staff was, I assume, hiding under their desks." He finally turned his full, unblinking attention back to the entire room, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "As of this moment, Staff Sergeant Vance is in absolute command of this scene. Her orders are to be considered my orders. Her authority here is absolute. Is that understood?" A wave of stunned, mumbled assents rippled through the staff. They were no longer looking at a clumsy rookie nurse. They were looking at a legend, a warrior queen standing amidst the wreckage of a battle she had single-handedly won. The humiliation, the whispers, the condescending sneers, it all curdled into a profound, collective sense of shame and awe. Alara, for her part, simply gave the general a short, sharp nod, the first flicker of her old self returning to her eyes. The vindication was absolute, but the reckoning was yet to come. As General Thorne's intelligence officer, a hawk-faced man with a laptop already open, began processing the two captured assassins. The final, rotten piece of the puzzle fell into place. One of the men, the one Alara had disabled with the blow to his neck, was conscious, though disoriented. Under the threat of being handed over to Thorne's less-than-gentle security detail, he began to talk. He spoke of an inside source, someone who had confirmed the diplomat's arrival time and route, someone who had been paid a substantial sum to ensure that if the initial attack failed, the medical complications in the ER would not. It was a simple, brutal contingency plan. The intelligence officer's fingers flew across his keyboard, his expression grim. Cross-referencing cell tower data with hospital employee records was a task that took him less than 90 seconds. He looked up, his eyes finding General Thorne. "Sir," he said, his voice flat and cold. "The call to the handler's burner phone was made 30 minutes ago. It originated from inside this building, triangulated to this floor. The phone is registered to Brenda Ratchet." The name dropped into the silent room like a stone, and every eye turned to the head nurse, who seemed to shrink under the collective weight of their gaze, her face draining of all color, leaving a pasty, terrified white. General Thorne moved towards her, his steps slow, deliberate, and menacing. He was no longer a commander, he was an executioner. He stopped directly in front of her, his massive frame blocking out the light. "You," he said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that was somehow louder than his earlier commands. "You took money. You took money to let a good man die on your watch. You, a nurse, sworn to do no harm." Ratchet began to tremble, her carefully maintained facade of arrogant authority completely disintegrating. "No, it wasn't. They said it would look like an accident," she stammered, her words dissolving into incoherent sobs. Her confession, pathetic and self-serving, hung in the air, an admission of both treason and a profound betrayal of her oath. "You didn't just fail your patient," Thorne roared, his voice once again a physical force that made people flinch. "You failed your profession. You failed your humanity. You betrayed your country for a payday." He gave a sharp, almost invisible signal. Two of his military police officers moved forward, their faces impassive. They flanked Ratchet, who had now collapsed into a weeping, babbling mess on the floor. Her professional life was over. Her carefully constructed kingdom of petty tyranny had been utterly demolished. As they pulled her to her feet and clamped heavy cuffs on her wrists, her shrieks echoed through the ER, the pathetic, desperate cries of a hollow tyrant whose power had been revealed as nothing more than a fragile, pathetic illusion. They led her away, a disgraced, broken figure, leaving behind a legacy of cruelty and a profound lesson in the true nature of authority. Her downfall was as public and as absolute as Alara's vindication. In the quiet aftermath, as the diplomat was prepped for transport to a secure military medical facility, and the last of the forensic teams packed up, General Thorne approached Alara. The chaos had subsided, replaced by a strange, contemplative calm. The ER staff moved with a newfound quietness, their occasional glances towards Alara filled with a mixture of reverence and fear. She was cleaning her hands, her movements once again slow and deliberate, but this time it was not a feint. It was the calm of a storm that had passed. "That was some fine work, son," Thorne said, his voice now gentle, paternal. He used the old term of endearment, the one reserved for his most trusted, most respected operators, regardless of gender. It was the highest praise he could give. "I have a C-17 on standby at the local airfield," he continued, getting straight to the point. "We're spinning up a new unit, a global rapid response team, a small, elite group for medical tactical extraction, highly classified, high risk. It needs a leader, someone with your unique skill set. The commission is yours for the taking. We'll have you in a command position by the end of the month. Come home, Ghost. We need you. Your country needs you." It was the offer of a lifetime, a chance to reclaim her old life, to be given the power and status she had more than earned, to leave the charade of Butterfingers Vance behind forever. It was everything she should have wanted. Alara finished drying her hands and turned to face him. She looked at the general, a man she respected more than anyone, a man who was a father to her. Then her gaze drifted past him, across the now clean floors of the ER. She saw Leo, carefully restocking the cart Ratchet had knocked over, his movements now imbued with a new sense of purpose. She saw the younger nurses, working with a quiet efficiency, their fear replaced by a focused resolve. Her eyes finally landed on Dr. Ben Carter, who was leaning against a wall, watching her. He wasn't smiling. His face was a mask of weary, humbled understanding. He had seen what she was, had seen the darkness she carried, and he hadn't flinched. He simply nodded at her, a gesture of profound, shared recognition between two warriors who had found themselves in an unexpected trench. She turned back to Thorne, and for the first time in a long, long time, a genuine, tired smile touched her lips. "My war is over, General," she said, her voice quiet but firm, the voice of Alara Vance, not Ghost. "I left that life for a reason. I came here looking for quiet." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room again. "But maybe I was looking for the wrong thing." A new idea, forged in the crucible of the last hour, began to take shape. "Your offer, a command post behind a desk, that's not me. But what if I stayed here? What if, with your backing, we built something new? A training program. We could teach people like him," she nodded towards Carter, "and them," she gestured to the nurses, "how to handle things like this. How to bridge the gap between civilian emergency response and military-grade threats. A ghost program, to prepare them for the days when the front line comes to them." General Thorne was silent for a long moment, studying her face. He saw not the retreat of a soldier tired of fighting, but the advance of a leader finding a new, more important battlefield. He saw that she wasn't choosing to remain hidden. She was choosing to build, to teach, to lead in a different way. She was choosing purpose over title, a mission over a rank. A slow, proud smile spread across his face. "Staff Sergeant Vance," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "That might be the best strategic proposal I've heard all year. You'll have my full support, whatever you need. Just write the budget." Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the linoleum, Alara found herself sitting in the small, quiet break room, a cup of steaming coffee in her hands. The door opened and Dr. Carter walked in, pouring a cup for himself. They sat in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, the unspoken understanding between them a tangible thing. "You know," Carter said finally, his voice low, "for a ranger, we were taught to read people, to spot threats. I looked right at you for 6 months, and I didn't see a thing." Alara took a slow sip of her coffee. "That was the point," she replied softly. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the table. "I saw that look in your eyes today, during the worst of it. I've seen it before, in the mirror." It was a confession, an admission of shared trauma, a recognition of the invisible weight they both carried. He finally looked up, meeting her gaze. "I'm glad you're staying, Vance. This place needs a ghost." Alara looked down at her hands, no longer fumbling, but steady and sure. The story of the clumsy rookie nurse was over. A new one of quiet strength and profound, hard-won competence, was just beginning. The greatest strengths are not always the ones that are shouted from the rooftops, but the ones that move silently in the background, waiting for the one moment when they are needed most. True authority is not seized through arrogance and bluster. It is earned through quiet competence and the courage to act when all others are frozen in fear. And sometimes, the most unassuming person in the room is the one who is single-handedly holding the entire world together.